Their job was to feed us well, treat us decently, so that we would have a healthy baby that could go on and be adopted. Phone pinged and looked down and it said, parent-child match. This is not just me giving this one girl, myself, a voice. This is me writing for all of us.
Laura got pregnant in high school. It was the 1960s, and it was immediately made clear to her that she would not be able to keep her baby and would be sent to a home for unwed mothers. The experience of giving her child up changed her life in so many ways, and she always thought about her son. One day, by chance, he took a DNA test with the same company she had, and they were able to reunite after almost 50 years. She is one of the sweetest and most positive people I've ever met, despite everything she's been through. Here is my interview with Laura. What was it like growing up in the South in the 1950s and 60s?
Well, I grew up in a medium-sized town on the Gulf Coast, and it was a wonderful place. Just a great place to grow up. It was, perfect for like the 1950s. You see the TV shows, and that's how it was. It was a small enough town that people all knew each other. People were related to each other. Our family was a nice, tight family. There were a multitude of cousins and aunts and uncles, and my parents, were in love with each other. We went to church on Sundays. I was a good student. It was a great life. I look back at my childhood, and although my mother had, some serious depression problems and issues, it was not something a child really looked at that way. I just thought, everyone had a mom like that. But she pulled herself through for many things, and I had a grandmother next door, which was wonderful because I was her only granddaughter, so I was spoiled rotten. And she just taught me so much about life. So many things I do today, I think, I learned this from my Grammy, and pretty much was over at her house every day when I was growing up. I loved her so much, and she was almost like a second mother to me in many ways. Very, very different than my mother. So I think I had a really good childhood, good life. And as a teenager in the 60s, well, it was a good time. There were so many things going on, like Beatles and, all the fun things that happen for teenagers, and times were a changing, and like I said, I was a good student. I belonged to a lot of clubs and organizations, and I was president of the MYF at our church, and I really felt like I had a good life. I knew I did. I knew I was loved, and that was important. I had 3 brothers that were all younger than me, so I was always, the big sister, and they were always the bratty little pest brothers. And one brother, the oldest brother, was only 15 months younger than me, so people used to joke about we were almost like twins because we were so close in age, and he surpassed me real early as far as his height and everything. But I was still always, in charge, the big sister. So, yeah, I had a great time in high school. Actually, the first year in high school, I had met a guy through one of my cousins who was not from that area, and he was very different than all the boys I'd gone to school with, because back then, where I lived, we never changed schools. We had the same school friends from the time we started first grade all the way up through high school. So that was really nice too, because, you knew everyone, you were familiar. I never had to go to any kind of different school. Yeah, all in all, I had a good life when I was growing up. And I can't look back and say that I didn't, It was so much better than a lot of people I've talked to since. I always knew my parents were going to be there for me as far as being at home, and my mom didn't work. My dad did. He was home religiously every day at like 4:30. So I had a very stable feeling growing up in my home.
So was the morality and like the sense of right and wrong back then mainly tied to religious beliefs?
I think so. In our case, I felt like I was a good girl, which was what I wanted to be, a good girl, good boy. I did all the right things as I was growing up. As I became a teenager, I got a little more rebellious. When I look back and think of rebellious, believe me, it was in my own mind. I never got in trouble. I look back, I skipped school once. It was such a big deal. One time in high school, I remember skipping school. And so I look back at that and I think, gosh, you thought you were such a rebel, but you really weren't. And, I remember wearing eye makeup, and it was a big deal. I remember my Grammy saying, I just don't understand. All of you young girls, you put that black liner around your eyes and you look so sad.
Oh,
And it was, she came from such a different world.
right.
And, I remember I colored my hair one time and she was horrified, that kind of thing. It was such a different world. We were totally innocent and didn't even know it. We thought we were so out there and cool, but we really, I did sometimes smoke a cigarette, and I did drink beer sometimes at the river with my boyfriend, but we weren't. Look at my grandchildren today, and I think we had no clue about so many things, and they are so aware of things that I was clueless about. We knew nothing about birth control in our hygiene class. In junior high, we were taught the girls would have a period and boys had sperm, but it was just very elementary and basic, and nothing about getting pregnant, because God forbid, why would you even ask such a question? I knew nothing about that. And I don't want to sound like I was a Pollyanna, because, I did do a few things, but in the long run, no, I tried to do what was right always. I was always considered a good girl, good student, and I don't think anyone thought I was doing anything wrong. My grandmother was a little worried when I started high school because I had that boyfriend, and that kind of worried her a bit because she felt like I spent way too much time with him. And my parents, although they expected us to do the right thing, they weren't as strict, I think, as some people's parents were. And I did get away with a few things, like coming in later than I was supposed to and things like that. And I don't remember any kind of huge restrictions, not like I was with my own kids when they grew up. But yeah, so I think I did what I thought was the right thing.
When you were in high school, the boyfriend that you were just talking about, you were in love and you ended up getting pregnant. How long did it take for you to come to terms with that as a young woman that you were pregnant?
Well, it was pretty much the shock of my life because I was like so horrified. I had not been around many pregnant people. My mother, of course, when I was growing up with my brothers, but I knew nothing about it. I was in total denial. And I was so ashamed that I had allowed this to happen. But at the same time, I knew from, having other girlfriends who had boyfriends that, sooner or later they would end up having sex. And I look back now and I think how incredibly naive we were that we could have sex. And, most of them did not get pregnant, of course, we did. And I remember thinking, if I wasn't sick, because I thought you got morning sickness. And if I wasn't sick, I really maybe wasn't pregnant. But I was at the same time afraid because I started having symptoms like my period, was not there and things like that. It was so horrifying to me that I hid it. Girls who got pregnant were always considered damaged goods. They were what, in my mind, had been talked about as if they were bad girls. They were girls who had, done such a horrible thing. So I was horrified at myself and I was in total denial. I remember when I was like a couple of months, and my whole life, I always looked pregnant from almost day one. I don't know why. Other people could go months when I started getting, the waist getting bigger. And I remember undoing my skirt. I had other symptoms like I was exhausted. I would come home from school and throw myself on the bed in my bedroom and, fall asleep instantly and things like that. It didn't have morning sickness like I thought that was the reason, that was a sign that you were pregnant. So anyway, I didn't tell my mother. She had finally pried it out of me, I guess, after months, 3 months probably. She was like beginning to see all these signs. And I'm sure, stupidly, I didn't think anything of it. She was the one who bought the sanitary napkins. All of a sudden, she had none to buy, for me. I look back now how silly I was to think nobody would figure this out. But my boyfriend, when I did tell him, by this time we had broken up. The summer before my senior year, we had broken up, but he would still come around or he would meet me. And I so wanted him to love me again. I would do anything he asked me to do. And I was so upset. And when I first told him, he wanted nothing to do with it. I remember when I finally stopped talking about it, he actually came to my house. It's very vivid in my mind when I realized he was going to be no help at all because we had broken up. And during the time we had broken up, we would talk on the phone and I would tell him all these places I would be going with groups of friends and other guys would be involved. And so he was so sure this was not his baby, but it was. And he was on the verge of joining the Army because even though he was in college at this time, he wasn't a great student. And he was a musician, which is what really appealed to me at first in my silly little teenage mind. He had told me if I was smart, I could take care of it. And he would give me some of the money, which he meant get an abortion. And I hardly even knew what abortion entailed. I mean, I knew it was getting rid of baby, but I didn't know much other than that, except it was dangerous. I did know that. And at this time, I wouldn't have even known where to go or what to do. So I had no support from him. And that just kind of left me very much alone. And when my mother found out, I finally confessed. She turned on me like I had never expected in my life. And so did my father. I look back now and I know they were, a product of the time. And back then it was an embarrassment to your family. It made your family look bad. It was going to ruin my reputation. And I honestly think that they had no idea what to do. So it was a tough, tough time when I told him within now, and I have to be honest here, this was so long ago, 56 years ago, within no time, and I'm going to say within a month of me telling her, so many things happened in that month that they're all boggled in my brain. And I have specific memories of certain things, but then I know a lot of other stuff was going on too. One of the things that happened is my father called my boyfriend's family and they refused to have anything to do with it. They said he was innocent and he had already joined the Army at this point and was in boot camp. My father drove me to the base where he was in boot camp.
Wow.
In Georgia, and we were, from the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. So it was quite a drive, and it is very huge in my memory because I honestly thought we were going to go in there and Daddy would, have the sergeant or whoever let us talk, and then once we talked, we would be able to, settle it. And once he saw me, he would be in love with me again. And I had such a fantasy life, and I was such a romantic, I guess typical teenage girl. And none of that happened. He never even saw us or talked to us. He didn't have to. The Army believed him. And when we came back, my father told his minister what was going on. And the minister suggested that I be taken to an unwed mother's home. Meanwhile, my mother had kind of softened over the month. And she said, like she was a victim, she said, we'll send you over there, you'll have the baby, and then I'll raise it like it's your brother or sister. And I look back now and I think, how would that even make sense? This woman does not look pregnant. Her daughter goes away for months, comes back, and she's had a baby.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of that happened back then. A lot of family members would adopt, but it was always a secret and always, horrible thing. And nobody would ever know, and what people did know. So when we got to the home, though, is when everything changed for me because I was let known that no, you are not going to keep this baby, and I felt so betrayed, so terribly betrayed. And I do remember that vividly too. It's like I was scared to death. I'd never lived anywhere but home, and now here I was in this place. I knew nobody. I didn't know what was going to happen. And I knew nothing about what was going on inside of me. There was no education, any sort, from anyone. So that's how I ended up in the unwed mother's home.
What was the area like where the home was located? You were from a pretty rural area. It was in a city, right?
Yes, it was right in the city of New Orleans, and it was in the Irish Channel area. It was one of those neighborhoods typical in New Orleans with the old homes, the Victorian homes, and even homes older than that. Some were kept up well, some were, in a state of decay. It was a very diverse neighborhood, which I had come from a totally white, typical Southern neighborhood in a smaller town. And it was an eye-opener to me. I saw all kinds of sights in the streets that I hadn't seen. And also, I don't know if there was crime there. I don't know that, now.
Mm-hmm.
But it was one of those places we were allowed to go for walks, but there was a perimeter we were supposed to stay within, a couple of blocks that we could walk around. So I got to know the neighborhood fairly well. There was a little mom and pop store right across the street, which is still there, by the way.
Hmm.
But now it has bars on the windows. But back then it didn't. And it was right directly, across the street from the home. So it was very different and very scary at first for me. But of course, I acclimated to it. And we did do some things when I was there. We would take the streetcar into New Orleans. We did that a few times. We weren't supposed to, and we did, a couple of girls and myself. I escaped it a couple of times. One time with my girlfriend, the one girlfriend who knew what was going on, who came from my hometown over to New Orleans, and we escaped for a few hours. So I got to see New Orleans and feel the vibe of New Orleans in some ways. And it was exciting to me. Of course, why I was there was not exciting, but it did instill in me the feeling of how, big city and how different it would be to live in a place like that.
Were you ever treated poorly by people out on the street when you did go out?
I don't remember much of that. In fact, a lot of times, I think that neighborhood was so used to seeing girls come in and out and, pregnant girls walking
Sure.
around
Yeah.
giggling, acting like, typical teenagers. Most of us were teenagers and were a few older and a couple that were very, very young. But I would say most of the girls were in my age group, 16 to 19, the majority of girls that I got to know. And so we were just, these typical teenagers. But the only difference was we had, big round belly and walking around in maternity clothes. Some of them had fake wedding rings. So when they went walking or whatever, they felt like if you had a ring on your finger, that meant you were married. You'd think the neighborhood knew, I'm sure. I know most of them would just kind of look away. There were a few people that were friendly, but I don't remember people being nasty or insulting. Southern people are very friendly and outgoing a lot of times, and even though it wasn't like it would have been in my hometown, I think, because it was a big city.
Yeah.
And maybe they were so used to it. And no matter what their private thoughts were, I didn't feel that at all.
Well, what was it like living in the home? Did the staff treat you well there?
Oh, yes, they did for the most part. There were a few that were condescending, but the ones that I worked with, because we all had jobs, were nice enough. Once again, I think they had to have a certain kind of person working in there that was tolerant of what was going on. And if they weren't, they didn't act out about it. I did feel like a couple of the ladies, like especially one of the ones in charge, was kind of condescending towards us. But I think she was just that kind of person,
Yeah.
without I look back and that's just her. I think, some
Yeah.
people are nippy. And also, I'm sure personalities. And I look back now and I think being sensitive and so young and so afraid of what people thought that I could have even read things wrong. I think that in the long run, their job was to feed us well, treat us, decently, so that we would have a healthy baby that could go on and be adopted. And that was their main goal. They fed us very well. I just remember lots of good meals. And, there was never a shortage of food. Sometimes we would sneak down to the kitchen and there was ice cream in one of the big freezers, and we would sneak the ice cream back up to our rooms, but we were never hungry. We just ate all the time. And we would go across the street and buy junk food and, cookies and candy and RC colas and root beers. And we smoked cigarettes. I mean, it was just like almost everyone I knew in there smoked. And I began smoking all the time too. It just, thank God I didn't continue the rest of my life. But I did during that time, and that's when I first did. The girls had a camaraderie. The first few weeks, I remember being petrified by the girls, scared to death of them. They were all saying things like out loud, like cuss words that I'd never heard young girls scream out. Like I said, they were very diverse. There were
Yeah.
some that were in college that were more worldly than I had been. I was fascinated by the girls. And the funny thing is, all those years afterward, I pushed it down, the memory of those girls. Once I started writing and I actually connected with a couple of them over this last few years. And it's like all these memories came up. We were a sisterhood,
Yeah.
it's like when women get together and they all have a common, commonality that makes them even more together. It's like a sisterhood, and it sounds kind of crazy, but it really was. And I love that, never having had sisters. Girlfriends have always been important to me. I thought we would all be friends for life, that wasn't the case. But yeah, there were times it was hard, it was boring, but at the same
Hmm.
time, we had jobs. That was probably part of the reason we had. And when I was there was no counseling. I don't even remember social workers, but I'm sure there had to have been. there was nothing like classes. We could not continue our education unless we did I did a continuing education, which I was terrible at completing. That was, through the mail, where you would take tests and mail them back. And we're talking snail mail. There was, of course, no computers in 1967. So, I look back and I picked up a few bad habits there, but I think it was just, I guess if you were in jail, you'd start, in order to fit in.
Right. Do we have to do?
Yeah.
So when did you start to feel a bond with your baby?
This is so crazy. Up until I went away, I didn't think my baby was real. Because, at first, when you're not having morning sickness, I honestly don't remember many things happening to make me feel pregnant. And still, the baby was so unreal. It was like, is this really happening? Until it began to show, really, obviously. It still didn't seem real. But I had just come to the home, and it was right at that same time that I had begun to feel the little flutters that you begin to feel. And that is when it just blew my mind. There was this almost instant connection. And I felt, you know, this is my son. Well, my child, my baby. I always thought it was a boy. I don't know why, but I did that with all my kids, and they were all boys.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought they were boys, but I just knew it was a boy. And I could feel that little baby from the time I started there. And it was my secret that I loved that baby being there.
Yeah.
I felt a connection. I felt like I was not alone. I loved this baby from the beginning after that. This is interesting to me. All my life, I grew up saying, when I grow up, I'm not getting married. I'm not having kids. I'm going to move away to Japan. That was what I thought I would do. And I didn't feel like I was maternal at all because I had to help a lot with my little brothers. And like I said, they were like a pain. And I didn't feel this need to be married. Other girls would dream of, this wedding and whatever. And I didn't. From the time I started working in the nursery there, because that's the main job I had for them almost the entire time. We started in the laundry. I think they started everyone in the laundry. And then we kind of moved on to, they kind of figured out where to put you to work. And I worked in the nursery, and I felt such a bond with those babies, and I loved taking care of them. As sad as it was to see them go away, because they were all, adopted sooner or later, I formed a connection with them. And it was a side of me that I hadn't even accepted in my own self, that I wanted to be a mother. I wanted to nurture these babies, and I wanted to figure out how I could keep my baby. And that was the prevailing thought the whole time I was there. And a lot of times it was secret, because if you talked about it, everyone was like, there's no way, you can't keep your baby. And I even mentioned it to the nurse I worked with, who I became very close to. And I tried to make it sound like, someone else, and then I also told her I thought my parents would never love me again. I honestly thought that they probably wouldn't, that they would always see me as flawed. And what had I done? How could I have done this to them? That was the way I felt. And in my mind, I visualized all these things happening. My boyfriend would arrive and save the day. I still had hope. And when my daddy would come to visit and say, we changed our mind, we want to welcome this baby. This was their first grandchild. Mm-hmm. So in being a grandmother today, I can't even imagine how hard that had to be on them as well. But their way of handling it was to not talk about it ever. And if I tried to talk about it, they wouldn't talk to me about it. They're called the silent generation. Well, they were, when it came to that, very stoic. And I guess they had to be that way. And it just was hard for me.
So the title of your book is You'll Forget This Ever Happened, which is something that you were told and you didn't forget it. But do you think that they honestly believed that you would be able to forget it and move on?
Done a lot of thinking about that. When I first started writing this book, my working title was Finding Jamie, Finding Myself, because Jamie was the crib name I gave my son. And as time went on and I was writing it, I realized how many times I heard that from my parents, from my grandmother, from the people at the home, the staff, from the girls. Everyone seemed to think we would go through this traumatic experience go home and start living our life like nothing had ever happened. Well, in some ways, we did because we couldn't talk about what happened. But at the same time, we were changed. We had given birth. We were mothers who weren't allowed to be mothers. We weren't fit to be mothers. My parents' reason was I was too young and could not do something like that without the help of a husband. And I know they firmly believed that. And I don't think my father wanted my mother to raise another child because she had a hard enough time, four of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was protecting not only her, the child. And in his mind, he was protecting me. So I do honestly think that some of them might have thought that I could go through life and forget about it.
Hmm.
And maybe somebody could, but I couldn't. And I've talked to so many other birth parents, birth mothers, said they couldn't forget that either. How could they? That child is part of you. You've held them for 9 months. You've gotten to know them for 9 months. The baby knows your voice. That baby, you know his every move. And how could you forget that? I couldn't. No
Yeah.
matter what had ever happened in my life, I could not forget what happened that summer. And it really changed the direction of my life and changed me in ways that it took me years to even realize how many ways it changed me. I know my mother and father, when I did move away, within a year and a half, I moved away. And I know that they didn't fight me moving away. If they were upset about me moving 2,000 miles away, they didn't give me any indication of that. And once again, they kept that to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I was an embarrassment or just every time they looked at me, they thought about it. But from writing the story, I realized that was said to all of us. You'll forget this ever happened.
Mm-hmm. When you left the home, you were feeling a loss and you were a lot of pain, but you were kind of made to feel like that was your punishment, like something you had to endure. And not too long after that, you got married. Why do you think you were so quick to get married? Do you think you were kind of searching for a way to like be reborn or reinvent yourself?
Yes, exactly. What happened was 3 months after I had come home, I was pretty messed up. I had so many issues, a lot of it just within myself. I'm sure, I did act out too sometimes, but I felt an anger that nobody would listen to me. And I couldn't talk to just anybody about it. I was told that this is a secret, don't you tell anyone because you will destroy your reputation. What will people think? And they will look at you as damaged goods. And this was said to me in all different ways, of course.
Hmm.
But in my mind, I bought right into it, knowing you can't talk about this. Of course, nobody ever suggested a doctor. That was just, maybe you need help. No, that never happened. So I did go to a beach party with my girlfriend and my brother. He invited us, I think, because he wanted her to go. And she talked me into going with them. And that's when I first met the man I would eventually marry. Now, this is so soon after all that happened. And then within 6 months, we were married. And once again, my parents didn't really fight me getting married at that young age, at 18, because that was kind of common back then for girls to get married right out of school and being married that young and starting a life that young. The man that I met, well, he was still a young boy. Oh, he was a man. He was in the Air. He was like a musician, another musician, and he was damaged in a lot of ways, which later I figured out, and I was damaged in a lot of ways. And we were like two damaged ships meeting in the night. And soon we started seeing each other. And then it led to, it was not a romantic relationship. I don't remember him ever being romantic. It was more like a survival for both of us kind of thing, finding someone. And he was from California. And I had been California dreaming the whole year. I just kept seeing things on the news about California, it was a summer of love and all that. I had this fantasy of living this free life and, starting all over again, and nobody would know me there. And one of the first things he said to me was when he got out of the service, he was going back to California. After he asked me to marry him, he made it clear that we wouldn't stay there. And he couldn't wait to leave there, actually. And I bought right into that. So I married him for the wrong reasons, and I know that, and it's likewise for him. And I wanted to have a baby right away. And I couldn't, God forbid, get pregnant again without having a husband. So I had my second son exactly 9 months in a week after we were married. And I was so happy to have my second son. I know he was in many ways a replacement for me. It was my chance to be a mom. And I wanted to prove my parents, we moved to California when he was 3 months old, but I wanted to prove that I was, a good mom and that I was not whoever they thought I was. And that's how that happened.
So, did you ever tell your husband about giving up your first son, and was he supportive towards you?
They told him before we got married. I told him because I felt it was dishonest to not tell him. And I didn't know if somehow, some way, someone else would tell him someday. We were still back there. And, a handful of people knew. And I told him one night, and he was furious. He said, "Don't you ever talk about this to anyone." He had the same attitude. "Do not mention this to anyone. Don't you ever tell my parents when we go back out there." And he said, "Do you love me as much as you love this Jamie?" And I'm shocked. And I said, "Of course." And he said, "If we have kids, are you going to love them as much as you love him?" He's a very selfish person. And he was, immature himself and just not sensitive at all, really, when I think back over the years. But he pretty much made me feel even worse.
Mm-hmm.
I remember thinking, well, I have to marry him because who else would want to marry me? And I thought I'd made a mistake by telling him. So once again, there was a secret within myself that was not to be shared. He never mentioned it again, and neither did I to him, ever. All those years went by. We were married 10 years. And during those 10 years, I had 3 sons with him, 3 beautiful sons. And each time I was pregnant, I worried that, I don't know why I thought this, but I worried God would punish me for having left my first son. What if something was wrong with the baby? What if, something went wrong again? This baby didn't live or something. And that's how crazy I was. I guess I shouldn't say crazy. I felt so guilty, grief. And so that's how it manifested inside of me, worrying about my other 3 sons. Fortunately, they all were healthy. And those were those were probably best years. I was a stay-at-home mom. Then I got to raise my sons and be the mother that I always wanted to be until he left.
So, you had 3 sons with him, and then you guys separated, but you did end up falling in love with another man and marrying and blending families with him. Were you afraid to tell him after the reaction of your first husband?
And my second husband, from the time we met on a soccer field, we became friends. He was a soccer dad and I was a soccer mom, and our kids were, when we first met, they were 7, 5, and 2. And it was a good relationship from the beginning because I felt like I could talk to him about anything. It was an instant attraction, although I was not looking for another man. At this point, I didn't trust men. I had not been treated fairly by them, I felt, and I wanted to never even be with a man again, really, at that point. But life, of course, has different ideas for us, and we became really good friends who could talk about everything. And he supported me in ways that I never felt from any other man. He honestly said this to me one time. I was trying to find a job because I was a single mom, and he said I would tell him how worried I was about taking care of my kids and being a mom at the same, and working outside of the home. And he said, "I think you're the kind of woman who could do anything you put your mind to." Nobody had ever said that to me. No man has ever said that, had ever said that to me. And that's the way he treated me. And so once we were together for 2.5 years before he asked me to marry him, because he didn't want to get married again. He'd had a divorce that had crippled him in a lot of ways. And he was such a good dad to his 2 children, and he felt like I was such a good mom to my 3, that he felt like we would just go on this married path forever. But I didn't feel right. I felt like my sons got to remember this is the late 70s, in 1980. I felt like my sons needed an example of a man and woman who were committed to each other and had, a bond, that I didn't want them to grow up with their mom having this boyfriend that never committed to her. And so I kind of pushed him into it, but he always jokes about that. He said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. And what happened was I did tell him, and I was scared to death, but I knew I could not marry him and him not know the truth, because he always went on and on about, what a good mom I was. And I thought, if he knows the truth, will he still think that? And I told him the truth. And it was a totally different feeling. I started it by saying, I hope you don't think less of me, that there's something about me that you don't know and you need to know. And I told him I had had a baby when I was a teenager, and I had surrendered him to adoption, closed adoption. And I regretted it my whole life. Well, he put his arms around me and said, I'm so sorry you went through that. Do you want me to help you find him?
You always thought about your son throughout your whole life, but you never told your other children. And what was the reason that kept you from telling them?
I was ashamed, and I was always afraid my boys would think less of me, that they would look at me with horror and, what? How could that happen? That they wouldn't understand. I still had that stigma. I still felt I would be judged. And I guess I couldn't stand the thought of my sons thinking that about me. And I kept thinking, too, that I would tell them when they were older. But at the same time, they kept getting older. The time never seemed like the right time. It never seemed right. And we're talking decades are going by here. Lots of stuff's happening. And, well, as life goes on and all the braided parts of life are going on, and you keep thinking, well, the time will come when I can sit down and tell them, but it didn't. Never happened.
You decided finally that you did want to try to find your son. How did you end up finding him?
Well, that was a miracle in my life, I feel. What happened was I looked over the years. In the 70s, I would go to the library with my boys, and they would, run off to story time or kids section or whatever. And I would look through different things trying to figure out secretly how to find the son. And it was one of these things where it was all snail mail, registering through this Soundex or something. I forget what it was called. And then there was also, once computers came along, I started trying to figure it out through computers. That was like in the late 80s, I guess, or maybe it was the early 90s, I guess, by the time that was happening. And it was always secret. I know my husband knew, but nobody else did. And I never could figure it out. I remember searching for hours at night on the computer with a little tiny font that we're talking primitive, that you could put your name in this place, and someone was looking for that specific birth date and that town that he was born in and all that. It was very, very time consuming, and it was just without help from any kind of private detective, which I couldn't have afforded. So I would give up. I finally reached the point where it had been almost 50 years. And I finally reached the point where I thought, maybe I'm never going to know what happened to him. All my thoughts and fantasies about what kind of life he was living, all my fears, was he healthy? Was he happy? I would even think, if he had died, would I know? It was just one of those things I never knew what was going to happen. Where is he? Where is he? I knew he was probably in the South, because I remembered most of the babies that were adopted from Louisiana families, Alabama, and Mississippi. So in my mind, I always visualized he, don't know why, but I'd always think he was adopted by an Alabama family. I don't know why. And he always had blonde hair, blue eyes. And I would think of him, and he would be with this big family in Alabama, and fantasizing, think of stories all the time. But what happened was, my husband said to me, why don't we do that ancestry DNA? Now, this was 2016. I had just retired. I had started taking classes or writing classes because I planned to write a family history for my sons. I'd always loved writing, and I'd never had time to really devote to it. So here I was retired, newly retired, taking classes. And one of the classes I took, the artist way. And one of the questions was if there was anything you could do in your life that you really want to do, that nothing would keep you from it, not, opinions of others, not money, what would it be? And I just automatically wrote on the top of my list, find Jamie. And I was even surprised when I wrote that. So I continued to write it. Meanwhile, we did the DNA test. And I would write, find Jamie. And I started to write about what happened in those days and my feelings about that time in my journal for the very first time. I could never even write about it because I was always afraid if I was writing in my journal the details, what if someone read my journal? Because if anyone's going to read my journal, nobody's interested in my journals, by the way. But I in my mind, my little pea brain thought, oh, I can't really write these words. And as you know, in the book, the only thing I had of proof of my son was his birth card. And the birth card that's on the cover of the book is the original birth card. And I kept thinking, oh my gosh, I'm writing all this down. And I actually talked to one of my girlfriends and told her she was taking a class with me. And I sat her down one day. We'd go for a walk after the class. And I sat her down and said, I need to tell you something. Once again, I said, I hope you don't think less of me. And when I told her, she was like, why would I think less of you? This is not 1967. Wake up. The world has changed. And she's very comforting and loving about it. And it blew my mind. So I thought maybe I am crazy because she's not horrified. And I just began to be a little more open about it. And I did start writing about it, the DNA, hoped and prayed that maybe he would do his DNA. But then I knew not to get my hopes up because nothing's happened so far. There's never been a sign that this person is looking for me or would ever even be able to find me. Well, sure enough, in October of that year, I was out walking the dogs and my husband was in the house watching TV. Phone pinged. I looked down and it said, parent-child match. It blew my mind. I almost fell down. My knees gave out. I ran in the house. I left my dogs out. I didn't care. I couldn't talk, couldn't speak. I walked in. I was like stuttering. And my husband's like, what? Well, what happened? Where are the dogs? And so he went out and got the dogs and came back in and he found me at the computer in my little office. And I was crying, staring at the screen because there in my private ancestry DNA page, it said parent-child match. And there was an email from my son. It was mind-blowing. All those years, I had thought about finding him, but I never went past what do I do after, what's going to happen afterward, right? And I always worried he would hate me. I always worried he would resent me because I had left him and hate me for doing that to him. I had no idea what was going to happen. I was thrilled and scared to death at the same time.
So when you were first able to talk to him, did he tell you that he had a good life growing up with his adoptive family and he wasn't angry with you?
Yes. When he first started mailing, it was it was very straightforward, no emotion. I was adopted. I'm looking for some answers. And he signed it Richard, and I was like, Richard. All my life he'd been Jamie. I remember thinking, they named him Richard. And so I wrote back. At first I didn't even write back. At first I was just like petrified. And my husband said, we both sat staring at the screen together. And he said, do you think it's him? And I said, who else would it be? DNA doesn't lie. And he said, well, just calm down, because I couldn't stop crying. And he went and made me a cup of tea. He wasn't even back in. But I decided to go ahead and say, could you please tell me your birth date? I typed that in. And I said, where you were born. Sure enough, within seconds, I thought he would take a while. I didn't think it would be an instant answer. He said, New Orleans, Louisiana, July 8th, 1967. Oh my God. I remember calling out to Gene, my husband, it's him. And so we began emailing back and forth. And he's very professional, very non-emotional. I'm falling apart. So I'm trying to answer his questions. I spent 35 years in sales, and I know that you do not, if somebody's not emotional, you just don't fall apart in front of them. You try to mirror their behavior to connect, right? And so I was not saying anything. Finally, I said, I am falling apart. I was honest. I said, I have wished for this day. All these years, 49 years, I have wished for this day to come. So he wrote to me and said, I'm falling apart too. And it was music to my ears. So then we became very honest with each other. And I said, I've always worried that, you would be so mistrusting of me. And if I did find you, I always worried that you would hate me for leaving you. He wrote me back the sweetest thing and said, I have never hated you. I was always glad you gave me life. I can't even imagine what it was like in those years as an unwed teenage girl. And his grace towards me was so healing and so kind. And I don't think he could have ever said anything better than the way he put it. And he said, can I call you tomorrow night? And I said, yes. By this time, we were both exhausted and overwhelmed. Meanwhile, I'm texting my girlfriend, the one I told, and said, what had happened. While we're emailing, I'm doing all this. And she was texting me back going, oh my God. I was looking up on Facebook too, trying to find him. And I wanted to see what he looked like. This is before we were exchanging pictures of each other. He had already looked at my Facebook, sneaking to see what I look like. And actually, his wife said, when we saw the picture, I said to him, there is no doubt that is your mother. You have her face. Oh. And he looked so much like me, so much like my mother's side of the family. And all those years, I thought he had blonde hair, blue eyes, he had dark hair and dark eyes, and didn't look anything like, it looked like he had kind of come from me alone. But she had found a picture of him. I found someone else on Facebook because I mixed up the name or did something wrong, and it was a blonde guy in Alabama. And he looked like he was really troubled and a lot going on there. And I said to myself, well, if this is him, it's okay because I'm his mother and I'll deal with whatever happens. And I was okay with it. And she says, he reminds me of Ian, who's my youngest son. There's something about him in this picture that reminds me of Ian. And I looked at this picture that I'm looking at. I think, what? And she texted me a picture from LinkedIn, and that was him. And I was stunned. So at least I had a face to go with the phone call. And that night was the most glorious night. We talked for 4.5 hours and just told each other so many things, and it felt so good. And that day, after we had connected, I went from worrying about what people would think about me for doing what I did to I didn't care. I didn't give a damn anymore. I said, what am I thinking? Who cares? This is the most wonderful thing. I just wanted to shout to the world, my son has found me. And then I had to. And then I had to start telling people. And the first people on my list were my sons, my other sons. And they were shocked. They were wonderful. They were wonderful. And my 2 bonus children were wonderful too. Everyone was in a state of shock. Everyone was blown away in many ways. They all reacted differently because they're all 5 different individuals with 5 distinct different personalities. And the most common thing was, though, the common denominator was they loved me, didn't care anything. There were no hard feelings towards me. Yeah. I don't know why I thought there would be, but they were, Mom, if this is healing a hole in your heart, I am so happy for you. And taught me so much about holding secrets inside of us that we have guilt about or shame about. And when we finally release that secret, it is one of the most healing things you can do for yourself. Mm-hmm. Because I'm not going to say that every human being that I've ever told the story has said, I'm so happy. And there's been some naysayers, and there have been people that said, oh, just wait, it won't continue to be a good reunion. And I mean, there's been very few comments like that. But for the most part, it gave me a renewal of faith in mankind. The fact that people are there for you, not against you. The majority of people have all had secrets, or have all had, well, I think every human being on earth has had things that they were maybe ashamed of in their past. And I've learned that holding in that secret is so hard on the secret keeper. And to release that and let it go is healing in a spiritual way as well as a physical way. It is the best thing I ever did was to start talking about my truth and let people just go from there. And I had to think too, what if one of my friends told me this had happened to them? Would I be judgmental? No, of course not. So why I thought everyone else would be, I don't know.
What was it like the first time you were able to meet him in person, and what were you the most nervous about?
I wanted him to like me so much. 4 days after we connected on Ancestry, I was telling, various friends, but told the boys first, then went from there to special friends
Hmm.
and couples we knew and relatives that didn't know my husband's relatives, and even a lot of my relatives didn't know. So it was a charged 4 days of telling people. And I was at lunch with one of my very dearest friends, and I was telling her, and tears were running down her face. Laura, why didn't you tell me? I would have been there for you. And I'm like, well, what's done is done. I'm telling you now. And we're having this really emotional, the waiter was like very concerned. Is everything okay over here? We're like, yes, everything's good. So we're talking, and I said, oh, here's his picture. And I showed her his picture on my phone. And she's looking at it, and then she goes, wait, I think he's texting you. And I said, what? And I looked at the text, and he said, hey, do you mind if I fly out and see you? And I wrote back, please, I'd love for you to fly out, because he was still in Louisiana and I was in California. And he said, okay, I'll be there tomorrow. It was like, what? So it was just 24 hours of me, nervous wreck, waiting for him to get here. I kept saying to Gene, I hope he likes me. And he was like, what are you talking about? Of course he's going to like you. I made a little sign and put in the guest bedroom, welcome home, Jamie. The guy still thought of him as Jamie. And long story short, when he got here, I said to my husband, we decided we wouldn't have anyone else here for the first meet, just me and my husband. My friends were texting me, take pictures. And, my kids were like, I hope it goes good, Mom. They were kind of nervous. And so sure enough, he gets here. And I said to Gene, you know what? Why don't you open the door and then I'll be in here? And he goes, honey, we're not going to stage this. You should probably open the door. And I was like, okay. But I guess I was really nervous. And so when I opened the door, I didn't even wait for him to make it all the way up the walkway. I ran out to him. I, started to run out, but he met me and threw our arms around each other. And here's the funny thing, Miranda, it was not like I was hugging a strange man.
Yeah.
It was like I was hugging one of my sons. I felt that body. It was like how when you touch your children, sometimes it's like touching yourself. Hard to
Yeah.
explain. It's like a feel of their skin and their muscles and their body is almost exactly like your own.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
That's how I felt. I felt like I was hugging my son, and it was beautiful. It was remarkable. He came in the house, and we spent that first day getting to know each other and telling stories, and we were both talkers and storytellers, and I loved hearing about his life. He kept staring at me and saying, oh my gosh, you are Maddie. That's one of his daughters. He has 3 children. And I said, I saw pictures of her. She does look like me when I was little. He goes, no, no. When you meet her in person, you're going to be shocked. Because not only does she look like you, she acts like you, she talks like you, she loves books. She's a bookworm just like as I am too. And, she loves to write. She loves to read. She loves theater. She's this, she's that. I mean, he described me as a little kid. This is so beautiful because I never would have even known those 3 children existed unless we connected. He only stayed a couple of days. Well, he stayed 2 days and then he left on the 3rd. It was so hard that day he left. When he was here, he only met my youngest son that first visit because it all went so fast. We were trying to cram, everything in. And that was a beautiful thing too. I'll never forget. My son met us at a restaurant, and my youngest son, Ian, and he came quickly to our table. We were sitting outside. We wanted to show him different things in San Diego because he'd never been to San Diego. So we're showing him all these different things. And we were sitting in this restaurant in Coronado, which is, the city is right. There's the bay and then there's the city. It's a beautiful view. And my son comes outside to where we're sitting and he goes directly to me and gives me a hug and whispers in my ear, he looks like Nanny. That's my mother. Then he hugs my husband and he walks over and just does the man hug thing with my son, my oldest son. And it was the most joyous thing because here I was seeing my oldest and youngest together for the very first time. And that was just It was just beautiful. It was the best couple of days. And it was so hard to let him go. And then I went back there within like a month and a half to meet his family. And sure enough, when I met Maddie, it was surreal. She was only 8 at the time. And I looked down into her face, and it was like looking at myself when I was a kid. I always wore glasses since I was 8 years old. And she had her little glasses on. And I just remember thinking, thank you, God. Thank you, God. This is happening. This is beautiful. And his children were all 3 so accepting and loving. They didn't even know they had a grandmother a few months before that. And here I was, and they were hugging me and treating me like they'd known me all my life. I thought, this is too beautiful. It's like crazy. You can tell that I was smitten by the whole thing. I was beyond happy.
So you spent the next couple of years getting to know them and you were traveling back and forth a lot. Is that right?
Yes, we were. I was lucky enough to be retired and able to fly back and forth, and a few times, 2, 3 times a year. And then he would come out here with his family, and then the last couple of times he came out with his children only. We spent Christmases together. This went on for 4.5 years. COVID happened, and as you know, as everyone knows, we were pretty much isolated. And because my husband and I are in our 70s, we were scared to death as far as to fly somewhere. So during the time COVID, he went through quite a bit of loss. His marriage dissolved. And by the time COVID came along, he had moved and was living in an apartment. He had his kids, whenever he wanted them, I'm sure, because that was the kind of relationship he had with his children. And his wife, who became his ex-wife, always said, no matter what, he was such a great father, the divorce would never come between him and his kids, And so we talked a lot during that year. There was a lot of other things that happened too. One thing I hadn't even mentioned yet is he had a lot of depression. And at first he kept a lot of it from me. But in many ways, he was like my mother, reminded me of my mother more and more the more I got to know him. My mother had that kind of depression and sadness. And I knew she'd had a hard life growing up. I know he had a very good life with his adopted parents, and he never really spoke badly about anything that happened when he was growing up, but he had this sadness about him. And I never realized how depressed and how bad things had gotten because, once again, I was not able to fly back. Everything was over the phone calls, texts, emails, not seeing him. And I've had other people, my other sons included, there were times that, and myself included, there were times that we've gone through depression, my husband, my friends. I mean, all of us have had times that were tough in our lives. And I remember as a single mom, a lot of times thinking, how am I going to get through this? And not knowing which way to turn. But I've always been able to pull myself out of this stuff, this dark, dark hole that we sometimes go down or travel down into that rabbit hole of doubt, fear. I've always, with my other kids too, I've always been able to talk to them. And afterward, they would say to me, could be years afterward, that sometimes right afterward, they'd say, Mom, it helped to talk to you. And even if you didn't follow my advice, I think just the fact that they could talk to me about what was troubling them is, huge, because I know it always helped me to be able to talk about it. So I would talk to him about what was going on in his life and, try to cheer him up and do all the things that moms do. I had no idea how bad it was getting. I've never dealt with something that serious, and I'm not a doctor and I'm not a therapist. I would ask him, I'd say, are you still seeing a therapist? Because he was. And he'd say yes. But little did I know he had stopped seeing a therapist. And there was no way for me to know that. So those 4.5 years went by, and I'd written my book about my experience, my memoir, and of course he's one of the main characters in it. And he had read my manuscripts. He was a great writer too. He was actually an attorney, and he had a really beautiful way with words. And he would tell me, what he thought about pieces I would send him, and he loved it. He kept saying to me, why don't you just self-publish it? And he wanted me to publish it like 2 years before I finally had it published. But that's how much he really liked it. He liked it a lot. And so I had just signed with a publisher, and I called him. 2021 is here. It's lighting me up about COVID. I got vaccinated because I wanted to fly back there and, see him. And so we called a few weeks after I had signed with the publisher. We called just to say hi and talk to him, and the girls were over there, and we talked to the girls, and he sounded happy. All of a sudden, he wasn't depressed and angry and going through whatever he was going through. And so when we hung up that day, we were, and I say we, because Jean and I had the phone on speaker. We were sitting outside talking to him. And he said, Mom, I just want to tell you something. And I said, what's that? And he said, I want to tell you you're the best thing that ever happened to me. And I said, oh, come on. I go, I'm not. Your kids are the best thing that ever happened to you. You've got amazing children, beautiful children. And he said, promise me you'll always be close to them, no matter whatever happens. And I said, of course I'll be close to them, close to all my grandchildren. Yes, I will. And I didn't even think twice about this. I thought it was very sweet of him to say that and say some really lovely things to me. So it was less than 48 hours later that I got a phone call from my grandson, his oldest child, and he told me his father, wasn't there anymore, and it was crippling. I can't even explain the grief. I've even tried to describe it, and I never can quite. I can't really describe how horrible it was. The fact that he had been that depressed and that sad and felt like it wasn't worth him being here, I still to this day am crippled by it. And at first, I almost wished we'd never found each other because it was that painful. It was that horrendous. And suicide is one of the most complicated, awful griefs because you go through this range of emotions. Anger is one of them. Like, how could you do this? But once you get past feeling like, how could you do this? And realize this person at this point is not thinking clearly, obviously. They think it's, better that they're not even here. And it was just, oh God, it was so hard. That whole first year was just, the grief is just overwhelming, and it kind of eases off, and then boom, there it is again. And I remember saying to Gene, sometimes I wish I'd never known him. And he said, don't ever say that again, because you got to know him. You got to know about his life. You always worried. Was he okay? Was he happy? Was he healthy? Now you know he was up until that last year and a half. And you also know that he loved you. You got to know him in such an intimate way. And then also our grandchildren that we didn't even know existed. We still have them in our lives, and they need you now more than ever because you're the only connection with him. And his adoptive parents had passed away. His mother had passed away 18 years before we even reunited. And his father was in his late 80s, and they were much older than me when they adopted him. And he had heart failure and died within a month after he and I connected. He never even told him that we had connected because he was afraid it would just be too much of a shock. He was going to tell him when he got better, but he never got better and died in the hospital. So I'm the only grandmother from that side. My husband, they call him Papa Gene. So the three children, the three beautiful, wonderful children that we never would have known about unless we connected. That kind of, helps. It helps a lot, really, because now I have them in my life. I don't know if I'm just clueless or what, but I honestly had never known anything about the high amount or the percentage of adoptees who actually commit suicide. And it blew my mind because I started looking into it and reading. I started reading all. It's my first time hope to God, my last time I've ever been involved with someone taking their own lives. And I'm not saying it's because he was adopted, but it was just such a shock to my system And I had never even read The Primal Wound. I had never really researched what was going on. I don't know what adoptees went through. And I'm ashamed to say that, but it's the truth. I didn't. And then the more I started talking with people who were adopted and friends who were adopted and getting to know so many different sides of the story, I thought, did this happen for a reason? I mean, did it take this for me to even understand? I'm so consumed in the grief I had and the shame and whatever was going through me that I hadn't even considered that this was going on him. So the last 3 years have been quite intense,
Yeah.
to say the least.
First of all, I'm so sorry that you didn't have enough time with him. That wasn't enough time. And I hated the ending of your book, by the way.
No. And, well, I almost didn't publish it because when this happened, I actually called my publisher and said, I can't publish the book.
Yeah.
Because the reason why, the book ends on a happy note. I mean, the book ends like a fairy tale, really.
Right. Yeah.
And I even kept saying I said this to a couple of my friends. I said, it seems almost too good to be true. It's so wonderful and blah, 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 blah. And I remember one friend said, Laura, even if it is too good to be true, enjoy the moment. Enjoy this is happening. She was right. Enjoy it. Enjoy the present. Don't worry that it's too good to be true. So when I said to my publisher, I don't think I can publish this book. Memoir is supposed to be true. And the truth is, this is horrible and painful and the worst thing in the world. So she was so kind. She said, well, set it aside and you just let me know what you decide to do. And, don't worry about the book. And so sure enough, about 7 or 8 months later, I was talking to a writer friend, an author that I know, and she asked me what was going on with me and my son. She goes, how are you guys doing now? She had been a beta reader for me, so she knew the story. But she didn't know, because I didn't hardly talk about it at all, really. I couldn't even hardly tell anyone what had happened, only my very closest friends. And so she said, Laura, your book's important. Your book's going to help people understand a time period and things that happened with you women. And you need to think about publishing it. And she goes, write an epilogue and then it will be true. And I said, oh, I can't write about that. It's too painful. I cannot write that. And she said, it does not have to be graphic details. Just sit down and tie the knot, close it up. And so I took her advice. I sent it to the publisher and I said, could this be added to the back of my book? And she said, yes. And so actually, when I read it now, I realize it's almost in a totally different voice than the rest of my book. And that is because I was so changed and it had been such a awful time. I think this is why it sounds so different as far as, the emotion. And I've had people even say that. It seems change with that. And it was changed because I was changed. I was very changed.
I almost didn't even read the last page because I didn't want it to end that way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Nice.
no.
No.
I mean, I hated that happened. Do you feel like you're still able to get to know your son further through his children and his friends and family and the memories?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Every day, once again, I've never forgotten. I think of him every day. I don't think maybe every hour. I was so hurt first, inside, crumbled, and I went through so much pain, like everyone else was. I mean, it wasn't like I was the only one going through all this. I woke up one day, and I remember thinking, months and months had gone by, probably a year. And I remember thinking, I cannot let this be what defines me. I cannot be that sad, angry woman that my mother was. My mother had a lot of things happen, and she would hold it and hold it. I mean, I feel bad for her that she couldn't see past bad things. And I thought, I will never not grieve my son. I will never not love him. I don't care what any of my kids do. I would love him no matter what. But I can't let this color my life because I cannot be sad forever. I have so many good things in my life. I have my other children. I have 10 grandchildren now. And I don't want to be a sad, sad, sad woman. I want to honor him in a different way. I want to be joyful for what we did have and what we still have through his children. I want to be an example of a happy person because basically I've always been a happy person. And I want to honor the fact that my other children are still here. I feel every day grateful that they are because I know how quickly something can change. This has taught me, if anything, I want to have learned from this experience and to honor my son in that way and to honor our reunion in that way, not to be sad and just not to let it destroy what we had.
I really did love your memoir. It was amazing. And I loved all your descriptions and your people and the places and all the feelings that you were able to convey. Are you working on writing anything else right now?
Well, you remember I said something about the family history. I've taken so many different courses and I'm thinking about a memoir type book, but it's not like a straightforward linear type book, but a lot of different stories about different things, motherhood, childhood, my childhood, stuff like that. But also I started writing, I guess about 6 months ago. I started writing about when my parents met because it's kind of an interesting story. And well, I think it's a very interesting story. And my father used to tell me, said he was a storyteller, and he would tell me these different stories. And so I'm playing on that kind of thing. And it's kind of crazy because this thing of my parents meeting, it has to be somewhat fictional because they met in 1946. Of course, I don't know exactly what they were saying to each other and all that. So I'm having fun with that. And I don't know, finally wrote a few things that weren't about, the adoption and everything. And it's been very fun to me, whereas writing the memoir was a very intense emotional thing. It was pouring out my guts on the page and bleeding on the page. And I kept saying to one of my writing coaches, I kept saying to her, I don't want to sound like a victim. And she was like, but you were.
Yeah.
All of you girls were.
Yeah.
And when she said that, I realized, I said, you know what? I always took so much of this as guilt, of what I did. And I never even thought past me. As I was writing it, I thought, this is not just me. This is not just me giving this one girl, myself, a voice. This is me writing for all of us because there's so many of us. There's hundreds of thousands of us. And we're all old ladies now. Not all of us. Some of them are not quite as old as me. But the point is, we're finally able to talk about it. We're finally able to say, this happened to me and this was wrong. This happened to my child and this was wrong. And I'm not saying there's not a place for adoption. Of course there is. But at the same time, the way this was handled, and look at the damage that it did to generations of women and their children,
Mm-hmm.
the way it was handled. The closed adoption was just like you go through life not knowing. Either side doesn't know. It's a really awful thing. So I got over worrying about sounding like a victim. I didn't want to sound like a victim, but at the same time, I wanted to be honest and real about it and tell it like I lived it and what I thought, and finally be able, after all those years of silence, talk about it and finally open up that secret that was bubbling inside of me all that time.
So, do you think times have changed regarding how unwed mothers are treated? I mean, I know just for me personally, 18 years ago when I was pregnant and not married, I was shocked at the way that some people still treated me in 2007. Do you think that things have changed?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question because I honestly thought things had changed because I do not feel, of course, any judgment towards any woman who's pregnant, regardless of how it happened, when it happened, how old she was, or whatever. I was thinking this way all these years that things had changed, people were more accepting. I went to a Cub convention, Concerned United Parents, Birth Parents. I went to it's a retreat. I always say convention. It was a retreat. And it was in October of last year. I met several young women who had gotten pregnant and in many ways been coerced to give up their child. I was shocked. I was like, are you kidding me? This is still going on? And they told me about how they had been treated. And this is like recently, like, in the last, one of them was like the last year that I talked.
Wow.
I am shocked that things are not better than they should be. I did meet a few women belong to these organizations that now are available to unmarried women who are pregnant and feel like there's no support in any direction and that they're alone, that are trying to help these women to make it their choice, not have some social worker or family member or whatever talk them into doing something they really don't want to do. They're helping them with education. They help them find a job and help them, if they want to be a single mother, help them to be a single mother, to support them in what they want. So that has been good to learn that. But I honestly thought things were better than they are. I can't even imagine judging a woman for that. It's terrible. And I mean, to hear that you were even going through that is just, it irritates me. It's like, who do people think they are? I mean,
Yeah, I didn't even really think about it until I started doing the podcast, but my son's father's mother had given me an adoption pamphlet for like an agency, and I just totally blocked that out until recently. But yeah, so I was 21 years old and they were still like, "You're not married. You should give your child for adoption," you know? Crazy.
and that's the whole thing too. It's like, that is her grandchild. It's just like,
Right.
it's like, how could they? I can't even go there. In fact, one of my sons, my second son's, had a wife that was a piece of work, and I wouldn't even go into that. That's a whole nother story. But she mentioned something about giving up their child for adoption, and they were married.
Hmm.
I went insane. I went into it, and I couldn't even tell them what I lived through. I didn't even have to get to that because I went so insane over that. It was like, that will not happen. That is not going to happen. And to think that people can, in this day and age, to judge a young woman or an old woman or any woman for what she wants to do and to try to talk her out of it, and something that is so vital in our lives, something that is one of the most important things, is the most important thing I think that we ever do. To judge someone just,
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with being supported at home too. Like if you have a good support system, parents, sister, brother, whatever, I think that makes a big difference.
and nowadays, I would hope that generations like yours were raised, you know, with more acceptance and love and have the support that you would need. I can't even go there in my thoughts to think I would care what anybody would think of my daughter being pregnant. I mean, I can't even, who cares? You
Right.
know, that's like none of their business, number one. But like I said, I am an example of a woman whose life was so colored by what happened, what that did to me. And I mean, a lot of these women still cannot talk about it. And when I have talked to some of them, I'm shocked. Some of these birth mothers still can't. But at the same time, I'm not shocked because I know how much shame was layered upon us.
Yeah.
And I do know too that reunion is hard, even in the best case scenario. So some of them do not even want to look at, they don't want reunion. And I get it because it's always complicated, even when it's something everyone wants, because you've been apart for so long. You're strangers in some way. And then, but wait, we're blood.
Yeah.
So it's very complicated, and hopefully people will evolve.
So I really just have one more question, and that is what advice would you give to birth parents when they're preparing for their reunion?
To the birth parents,
Yes.
oh gosh, well, I feel like if I'm a birth parent and my child wants to connect with me and reunite, I think it's wonderful. And you might be scared to death, and it might not work out the way you expect it to, but just knowing who child is. I would look at my son and just remember that little baby that I only got to hold a couple of times. And now he was a man. And it was one of the most glorious feelings for me. It was like he was still that baby, but I knew him now. I saw what had happened to him. And it was so rewarding to know he had been happy, that he was healthy. And also, I would never told him, no, I don't want to. And I wouldn't have done that because how could I hurt him like that? No matter how it affected my life, because it was so worth it. It was so very worth it. I feel bad for the women or men who can't go there. And I know there's many, but I would tell them it is the most beautiful thing in the world. And even if it's scary and even if it's not going to turn out the way you want it to turn out, it's worth that knowing. I mean, just holding them is just, it's an amazing miracle feeling. It's magical. If anybody ever wants to reach out to me, they can go on my website and contact me through that, because I just love talking to anybody and everybody about this and, the concerns and the good, the bad, the ugly. So, but my website is Laura L. Engel, ENGEL.com.
Thank you so much for letting me interview you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's an honor to be talking with you. I'm so happy that Ed told me about you.
If you have experienced an adoption reunion and would like to speak about it, please contact me at whathappensadafterpodcast@gmail.com. Also, check out the show's Instagram to see pictures of my guests. Listen next time to find out what happens after. Thanks for listening.